The first thing you learn working the midnight shift at Lone Star Gas is that you don't ask questions you don't want answers to. The sign outside buzzes in an endless rhythm, bathing the lonely highway in flickering neon light. Behind the counter, a coffee machine wheezes like it's ready to give up, and the air inside smells like grease and stale air freshener. The job was far from glamorous, but at $90 a shift, I wasn't about to complain. Not when I needed it so badly. I hadn't planned to end up in a place like this, a nowhere gas station on a nowhere stretch of Texas highway. But running from your past has a way of leaving you with limited options. Denver was behind me, and everything I'd left there was a tightly locked secret. This place was a fresh start. That's what I told myself anyway, though the isolation of the endless flatlands didn't exactly feel like hope. It felt like purgatory. Shift starts at midnight, ends at 8, the gruff voice of Hank, the owner, had told me when he interviewed me in the tiny office behind the station. Hank was a stocky man with a permanent scowl and a cigarette that never seemed to leave the corner of his mouth. His gray hair was thin, but his demeanor screamed that he'd lived through things far worse than the tedium of running this place. Stay behind the counter unless you're restocking or cleaning up. Don't mess with the pumps unless there's trouble. Oh, and one more thing, keep to the rules. Rules? I'd asked, curious but still a little smug. I figured he was talking about regular workplace stuff, like checking IDs for beer sales or not getting caught pocketing cash from the register. Hank's face darkened slightly, and he leaned forward. Yeah. The rules. You'll find them under the counter. Don't ask me why, don't ask me who made them. Just follow them, kid, and you'll be fine. He didn't elaborate further, and at the time, I chalked it up to one of those quirky small-town superstitions people clung to. I was a city guy at heart, and as far as I was concerned, rules at a gas station were as straightforward as they came. Clean the floors, sell snacks and fuel, and maybe stop some kid from stealing gum. Easy. That first shift, though, it didn't take long for the cracks to show. By midnight, Hank was gone, and the station was all mine. I leaned against the counter, scrolling on my phone and occasionally glancing up at the pumps outside. The highway stretched into the darkness, broken only by the occasional flash of headlights cutting through the void. It was oddly peaceful, in a way I hadn't expected. I'd even started to relax, until I found the list of rules. The paper was laminated and taped underneath the counter, hidden from plain sight. The handwriting was neat, almost unnervingly so, with bold letters spelling out "Rules" at the top. Below it, 5 instructions were listed in crimson ink. Rule number 1, don't say no to any customer between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. Rule number 2, if a black car parks but no one enters, lock the doors and turn off the lights until it leaves. Rule number 3, if you hear someone knocking on the back door after 3 a.m., don't answer it. Rule number 4, always check the security cameras every 30 minutes. If one goes static, never investigate. Rule number 5, if you see a man with a scar running down his cheek, don't look directly at him. At the bottom of the page, in smaller handwriting, there was a final warning. Breaking the rules will bring consequences beyond imagination. I stared at the list for a long time, my stomach sinking with a mix of confusion and unease. What kind of gas station had rules like these? It felt like a joke, but there was something about the way Hank had spoken earlier, that gruff seriousness in his voice, that made me hesitate to laugh it off entirely. Still, the rational part of my brain overruled the nagging sense of dread creeping up my spine. The rules were ridiculous. Probably some prank left by an old employee trying to scare the newbies. It wasn't even a full hour into my shift when I heard it, the faint, tinny sound of static from the monitor behind the counter. One of the security cameras had gone out. I froze. The monitor showed 4 feeds from the cameras outside, one by the pumps, one facing the lot, one watching the front entrance, and one at the back of the building. But the feed for the lot was now a snowy blur, crackling faintly through the speakers. My mind raced as I tried to remember Rule 4, always check the cameras every 30 minutes. If one goes static, never investigate. Never investigate. I leaned closer to the screen, squinting at the static feed. My hand hovered over the buttons on the monitor, debating whether to cycle through the views. A shadow flickered briefly on the adjacent camera feed, the one pointed at the pumps. It was probably nothing. Just a bug or some random glitch in the system. But the shadow on the screen lingered in my mind, tugging at my nerves like an itch I couldn't scratch. I told myself it wasn't worth checking. After all, I wasn't paid enough to go poking around in the dark, especially not when my only backup was Hank, who was probably asleep in his bed miles away. The static feed didn't clear up, but I forced myself to ignore it, focusing instead on the small tasks of the night, sweeping the aisles, refilling the coffee machine, and tidying up the break room. My nerves settled for a while, but the rules lingered in the back of my mind like an unanswered question I didn't want to ask. The clock on the wall ticked past 12:45 a.m. I still had no idea what to expect from this place, but my gut told me the night wasn't done with me yet. As the clock crept closer to 1 a.m., the quiet unease that had settled over the gas station began to shift into something heavier, something more oppressive. The hum of the fluorescents above felt louder, their flickering light casting strange, jittering shadows on the shelves. The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows in their frames. I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. The static on the security monitor persisted, the feed for the lot still out of commission. Every so often, I caught myself glancing at the clock behind the counter, watching the seconds tick by as if they were leading to some inevitable climax. It was exactly 12:59 when the bell above the door chimed. I flinched, the sound far too sharp in the stillness. A man entered the store. He was tall, his figure lean and wiry under a faded denim jacket. His face was obscured by the shadow of his baseball cap, the brim pulled low over his eyes. In his hand, he carried a crumpled paper bag. He didn't speak at first, just wandered the aisles in a way that set my teeth on edge. Something about the deliberate slowness of his movement seemed unnatural, like he was savoring the moment. When he finally approached the counter, he placed the bag on it with a loud, crinkling thud. The smell hit me immediately, something metallic and sharp that turned my stomach. "I need a pack of cigarettes," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I reached for the pack on the display behind me, careful not to look at him too long. He didn't seem dangerous, not overtly, but there was a tension in the air now, coiling tighter with every second. As I handed him the cigarettes, he didn't take them right away. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his shadow falling over me. "Are you gonna say no?" he asked, his tone almost playful. The words hit me like a brick. Rule 1. Don't say no to any customer between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. "No," I said quickly, my voice shaking more than I wanted it to. "No, of course not." The man grinned. It was a horrible grin, too wide, his teeth yellowed and uneven. He grabbed the cigarettes and slid the bag off the counter, nodding as if I'd passed some kind of test. Then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he turned and walked out, the bell above the door jingling faintly behind him. I stayed frozen in place for several moments, my pulse hammering in my ears. When I finally found the courage to glance outside, he was gone. The pumps were empty, the highway stretching into the darkness without a single set of headlights in sight. The clock on the wall ticked past 1:05. I let out a shaky breath, convincing myself I'd imagined the smell coming from his bag, the strange grin, the subtle menace in his voice. But deep down, I knew better. The rest of the hour passed uneventfully, but the tension didn't leave me. I couldn't stop thinking about what would have happened if I'd broken Rule 1, if I'd told him no. And then there was the bag. What the hell had been in it? I tried to rationalize it as roadkill or something equally disgusting, but my gut told me otherwise. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. Not just of him, but of the rules themselves. When 2 a.m. rolled around, I allowed myself to relax slightly, though not entirely. The static on the monitor persisted, and I had the unsettling feeling that something, or someone, was watching me through the broken feed. I resisted the urge to check it again, reminding myself of Rule 4, never investigate. The wind outside howled louder, shaking the thin walls of the station. I busied myself with cleaning the counters, anything to keep my mind from wandering too far into the dark places it wanted to go. But the peace didn't last. At exactly 3:01 a.m., a loud knock echoed from the back door. My stomach dropped. I froze, every muscle in my body going rigid as I stared at the door leading to the break room. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Don't answer it, I thought. Rule 3. If you hear someone knocking on the back door after 3 a.m., don't answer it. The knocking continued, each one like a gunshot in the stillness. I stayed rooted to the spot, clutching the counter so tightly my knuckles turned white. Whoever, or whatever, was at the door wasn't going away. Hello? A voice called out from the other side. It was a woman's voice, soft and trembling. Please, I need help. Let me in. My throat tightened, and my instincts screamed at me to open the door. But the rules were clear, and I wasn't about to find out what would happen if I broke them. Please, the voice begged again. He's coming. Don't let him get me. I clenched my teeth, forcing myself to stay put. The knocking grew frantic, and I thought I heard footsteps scuffling just outside, like someone pacing back and forth. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I waited, straining to hear anything beyond the wind. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, and I finally allowed myself to breathe again. Whatever had been out there was gone, or at least, I hoped it was. I didn't sleep when my shift ended. I couldn't. The fear clung to me like a second skin, and even as daylight broke over the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was waiting just out of sight. By the time my next shift began, I had convinced myself the previous night's events were just my imagination running wild. Maybe the stress of starting over had gotten to me. Maybe the rules were a joke, some kind of sick prank Hank was playing to see if I'd crack. I kept telling myself these things as I drove back to the gas station under the fiery glow of a Texas sunset, but the knot in my stomach told me otherwise. Hank was waiting for me when I arrived. He leaned against the counter with his arms crossed, his eyes sharp and probing. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting shadows that made his lined face seem even harsher. "How's the night treating you, kid?" he asked. "Fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Quiet." He raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. For a moment, I thought he was going to call me out, but he just grunted and nodded toward the counter. "Good. Stick to the rules, and it'll stay that way. Screw 'em up, and," he paused, letting the silence finish the thought. "Right," I said, trying to sound casual. "What happens if someone doesn't follow them? I mean, hypothetically." Hank stared at me, his lips twitching as if he was debating how much to say. "You don't want to find out," he said finally. "Let's leave it at that." Before I could push him further, he grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. "One last thing," he added, his voice low and steady. "If you see him, don't let him know you're scared. That's what he wants." I opened my mouth to ask who he meant, but Hank was already out the door, leaving me alone with the faint hum of the lights and the growing sense that I was in way over my head. The first few hours of my shift passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every time I glanced at the security monitor, I half expected to see a figure lurking just out of frame. The static feed for the lot was still down, and the other cameras showed nothing but empty pumps and deserted highway. I tried to focus on mundane tasks, restocking shelves, wiping down the counters, but my mind kept drifting back to the list of rules and the strange occurrences of the previous night. Who had been knocking on the back door? And why did their voice sound so desperate, so human? Around 1:30 a.m., the bell above the door chimed, pulling me out of my thoughts. A man entered, his heavy boots echoing against the tile floor. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially obscured by a cowboy hat pulled low over his eyes. His jacket was dusty, and a faint smell of motor oil clung to him. "Evenin'," he said, his voice deep and drawling. "Evening," I replied, keeping my tone polite but cautious. He wandered the aisles, picking up a few items, a can of soda, a bag of chips, a pack of gum, and placed them on the counter. As I rang him up, he glanced at the clock on the wall. "You been workin' here long?" he asked casually. "Not too long," I said, avoiding his gaze. "Just a few shifts." He nodded, his lips curling into a faint smile. Heard this place has some interesting rules. The comment caught me off guard, and I nearly dropped the soda can. Yeah, I said, trying to sound nonchalant. Just some weird stuff the owner came up with. The man chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Weird, huh? You ever wonder why? I didn't respond, focusing instead on bagging his items. The man's smile widened, and for a moment, I thought I saw something glint in his eyes, something sharp and predatory. Be careful out here, kid, he said as he grabbed his bag and headed for the door. You never know who, or what, you'll run into. The bell chimed as he left, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I watched him climb into an old pickup truck parked near the pumps, its headlights cutting through the darkness as he drove away. The rest of the shift passed in a blur, my nerves fraying with every passing minute. At one point, I heard faint laughter coming from outside, a soft, eerie sound that seemed to drift on the wind. I checked the cameras, but there was nothing there. By the time 3 a.m. rolled around, I was exhausted and on edge. I stared at the back door, dreading the possibility of another knock. When the sound finally came, it was softer this time, almost hesitant. I froze, my heart pounding as the knock came again, followed by a voice, different from the one I'd heard before. Evan, it called, the sound muffled but unmistakably clear. My blood ran cold. How did they know my name? Evan, it's me, the voice said again, softer now, almost pleading. Let me in. Please. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to respond. Rule 3, don't answer. The voice continued, growing more desperate with each passing second. It's not safe out here, it said. You have to help me. Please, Evan. Please. I shut my eyes, trying to block out the sound, but the knocking grew louder and more frantic. Evan, the voice screamed, the tone shifting into something unnatural, something monstrous. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, and I stayed frozen behind the counter, too afraid to move. I didn't sleep when my shift ended. Instead, I drove home with shaking hands, the sound of that voice still echoing in my ears. The next night, I arrived at the gas station with a pit in my stomach. I had barely slept, my dreams plagued by distorted faces and soft, eerie laughter that seemed to linger even after I woke up. I considered calling Hank and telling him I couldn't do this anymore, but I knew I wouldn't follow through. I needed this job. There wasn't anywhere else to go, not with my past shadowing me like a black cloud. The gas station felt different as I stepped inside, quieter somehow, as if it were holding its breath. I checked the cameras out of habit. The lot feed was still static, but the others appeared normal, empty shelves, the dimly lit aisles, nothing out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I was halfway through restocking the snacks when the bell above the door rang. A woman entered, her face partially obscured by her long, dark hair. She wore a tattered coat too heavy for the mild night, and her hands were stuffed deep into the pockets. Evening, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't respond, her footsteps soft as she wandered the aisles. I couldn't help but watch her, something about her presence setting me on edge. She moved with a strange, deliberate grace, pausing occasionally to examine the items on the shelves. When she finally approached the counter, she placed a single candy bar down and smiled. Her teeth were too white, too perfect, like they didn't belong to her. Late shift, huh? She said, her voice light and casual. Yeah, I replied, ringing up the candy. Pays the bills. She tilted her head, studying me in a way that made my skin crawl. You like it here? I hesitated, unsure how to answer. It's quiet. Her smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. Quiet's good, she said. Until it isn't. Before I could respond, she grabbed the candy bar and turned to leave. The bell chimed as she exited, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I checked the cameras again, but she wasn't on the feed. I glanced out the window, but the parking lot was empty. I tried to shake it off and focus on my tasks, but the unease lingered. By the time 1 a.m. rolled around, I was counting down the minutes, praying for an uneventful night. My prayers went unanswered. At exactly 1:15, the bell above the door rang again. A man entered, tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his baseball cap. My breath hitched as I recognized him. It was the same man from the previous night, the one with the cowboy hat and the unsettling grin. He walked to the counter without browsing, his heavy boots echoing against the tile. He placed a pack of gum on the counter and smiled. "Evening," he said, his voice low and measured. "Evening," I replied, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "You're doing a good job, kid," he said, his smile widening. "Most people don't last long here." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded and rang up the gum. He didn't take it, though. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his grin stretching unnaturally wide. "You're following the rules, right?" he asked, his tone casual but laced with something darker. "Yes," I said quickly. His smile faltered, just for a moment, and his eyes seemed to darken. "Good," he said, straightening. "Wouldn't want to see what happens if you don't." He grabbed the gum and turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he stopped. "Oh, and one more thing," he said, his voice softer now. "He's watching you, you know. Always watching." My stomach dropped, but before I could ask what he meant, he walked out. The bell chimed faintly behind him, and the parking lot was empty again. I checked the cameras, half expecting to see him lingering outside, but there was nothing. I stared at the static-filled feed for the lot, willing it to show something, anything, but it remained stubbornly blank. The rest of the night passed in a blur of paranoia and adrenaline. I jumped at every sound, my eyes constantly darting to the back door, waiting for the knocking to start again. When it didn't, I almost felt disappointed. Almost. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, I locked up the station and drove home. My hands were shaking on the wheel, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Who was the man with the grin? How did he know about the rules? And what did he mean when he said someone was watching me? I didn't have any answers, but one thing was certain: Lone Star Gas wasn't just a job anymore. It was a trap, and I was caught in it. I arrived at the gas station that night with a feeling of dread that I couldn't shake. The memory of the man's grin from the night before lingered in my mind like a bad taste. His words, "he's watching you, you know," played on a loop, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just letting the isolation get to me. But deep down, I knew better. The station was eerily quiet when I stepped inside. The hum of the fluorescents seemed louder than usual, and the static on the lot's camera feed felt almost mocking. I tried to go through my usual routine, stocking shelves, wiping counters, but every sound made me jump. Even the creak of my own footsteps felt wrong, like they didn't belong to me. At 12:30 a.m., the bell above the door rang. A man walked in, his hood pulled low over his face. He moved with a strange stiffness, like his joints didn't work quite right. He didn't browse the shelves or approach the counter. Instead, he stood in the middle of the store, his head tilted slightly as if he were listening to something I couldn't hear. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice shaking despite my effort to sound calm. He didn't respond. "Sir?" I tried again. This time, he turned his head toward me. His hood slipped back slightly, and I caught a glimpse of his face, or rather, what was left of it. His skin was pale and mottled, as if it had been stretched too tightly over his skull. His eyes were sunken and lifeless, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin that didn't match the rest of his expression. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. He took a step toward me, then another, until he was standing on the opposite side of the counter. "Do you know who's watching you?" he whispered. His voice was raspy and thin, like it had been dragged over shards of glass. I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. "Do you?" he repeated, louder this time. I shook my head, my hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The man's grin widened, and for a moment, I thought he was going to lunge at me. But instead, he turned and walked out of the store, the bell chiming faintly behind him. I stared at the door long after he was gone, my breathing shallow and uneven. The room felt colder somehow, the air heavier. I checked the cameras, but the lot feed was still static, and the others showed nothing unusual. The clock on the wall ticked closer to 1 a.m., and I felt the weight of the rules pressing down on me like never before. If tonight was anything like the others, I knew I was in for another test, a test I wasn't sure I could pass. At exactly 1:05 a.m., the bell rang again. This time, it was a woman. She looked ordinary enough at first glance, mid-30s, dark hair pulled into a ponytail, wearing a gray hoodie and jeans. But there was something off about her posture, the way she held herself. She walked to the counter with quick, jittery movements, her eyes darting around the store as if she were looking for something, or someone. "Water," she said, her voice clipped and breathless. I grabbed a bottle from the cooler behind me and placed it on the counter. She didn't touch it. "Cash or card?" I asked. "Doesn't matter," she snapped. "Just give it to me." The way she said it sent a shiver down my spine. Rule number 1 flashed in my mind: don't say no to any customer between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. "Take it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She grabbed the bottle and started to leave, but then she paused at the door. "You should leave," she said without turning around. "What?" She turned her head just enough for me to see the edge of her profile. Her eyes were wide and panicked, her lips trembling. "Leave," she repeated. "Before he finds you." The bell chimed as she walked out, leaving me alone with the suffocating silence. My hands were shaking as I checked the cameras again, but just like before, they showed nothing. At 1:45 a.m., the bell rang once more. This time, I didn't look up right away. I didn't want to. "Good evening," a deep voice said, calm and deliberate. I forced myself to raise my eyes, and there he was, the man with the scarred cheek. The Phantom. He was taller than I remembered, his presence filling the room like a shadow stretching across the floor. His scar caught the light as he smiled, a slow, deliberate expression that made my skin crawl. "I hear you're following the rules," he said, his tone almost conversational. "Good for you." I didn't respond. "But rules," he continued, leaning slightly over the counter, "are tricky things. Easy to break. Easy to forget." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Tell me," he said, his smile widening. "Do you think you'll make it through the night?" I couldn't speak. Couldn't move. He chuckled softly, then straightened. "We'll see," he said, turning to leave. As he reached the door, he glanced over his shoulder. "Oh, and Evan? You're running out of time." My heart stopped. The bell chimed, and he was gone. The clock struck 2:30 a.m., and the silence in the gas station was so thick it felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. Every sound, the hum of the neon sign, the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights, seemed amplified, and my own breathing was ragged and uneven. My mind was racing, replaying the Phantom's words, "You're running out of time." How had he known my name? I had never told anyone here. The idea that he knew more about me than I was willing to share left a cold pit in my stomach. I retreated to the break room, hoping for a brief moment of respite. Sitting on the sagging couch, I flipped through the journal I had found on my second shift. It was weathered, the pages yellowed and brittle, but the entries were vivid, recounting experiences from someone who had worked here long before me. Descriptions of knocking at the back door, laughter coming from nowhere, and shadows moving across the windows matched my own encounters. The writer mentioned something that hadn't happened to me yet, the moment when the cameras would all go black. The journal ended abruptly, with a scrawled message that sent chills through me: "When the cameras go black, it's too late. He's already inside." As if on cue, the hum of the monitors in the main room shifted. My stomach dropped as I rushed back to the counter. The lot camera, as always, was nothing but static. But this time, one by one, the remaining feeds began to flicker. First, the feed showing the aisles of snacks went dark. Then the one above the counter. Finally, the camera that monitored the back door crackled and went black. My chest tightened as I stared at the blank screens, my reflection distorted in the cracked monitor glass. I didn't move at first, frozen by indecision and fear. The journal's warning repeated in my head like a mantra. Don't investigate. Don't investigate. But I couldn't ignore the soft tapping that started at the back door. It was faint at first, almost gentle, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent, like someone, or something, was trying to force its way in. I stepped back from the counter, gripping the edge as my vision blurred with panic. The rules had been clear: do not answer if someone knocks at the back door after 3 a.m. I glanced at the clock. It was 3:01. The knocking stopped abruptly. I held my breath, waiting for it to start again, but what followed was worse. A voice, low and raspy, came from the other side of the door. "Evan," it said, dragging out my name like a predator savoring its prey. My legs nearly gave out. Whoever, or whatever, it was knew my name. The voice continued, soft and coaxing. "Evan, you don't have to be afraid. Open the door. Let's talk." I backed away further, my hands shaking. The voice changed, becoming lighter, more familiar. "Evan, it's me. You remember, don't you? I've missed you." I froze. It was her voice. Caroline's voice. She had been the one person I loved most in the world, the one I had failed to protect. Hearing her speak now, miles away from the life I'd left behind, was impossible. "Evan," the voice said again, tinged with sadness. "Why did you leave me?" Tears blurred my vision as I pressed my back against the counter. "You're not real," I whispered. "You can't be real. Open the door, Evan. Please. I need you." The knocking started again, more violent this time. The door rattled in its frame as the voice called out, pleading, accusing. I dropped to the floor, clutching my head, willing it to stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the knocking ceased. Silence returned, but it was the kind of silence that felt alive, pregnant with menace. I stayed on the floor for a long time, too afraid to move. When I finally mustered the courage to stand, I approached the monitors again. To my relief, the cameras flickered back on, one by one, their grainy images returning to the screens. The back door feed was empty, but the asphalt leading to it was wet, as if something had been dragged away. I tried to convince myself it was over, but deep down, I knew better. I could still feel it, the suffocating presence of something watching me, waiting. The minutes crawled by. At 3:30 a.m., the black car returned, its headlights cutting through the darkness as it pulled into the lot. The engine idled for a moment before the car door opened. I braced myself, expecting the phantom, but the figure that stepped out was someone else. It was a man in a dark suit, his features obscured by the shadow of his hat. He walked with a deliberate slowness, his footsteps crunching against the gravel. He stopped at the window, his head tilting as if he were peering inside. I ducked behind the counter, holding my breath. When I finally dared to peek, he was gone, but the doorbell chimed, signaling his arrival inside. I stood slowly, my legs trembling. The man stood at the counter, his hat pulled low over his face. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm and smooth, almost disarming. "Can I help you?" I asked, my throat dry. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and placed something on the counter, a small red card. It was blank except for a single word written in black ink, "Run." My heart pounded as I stared at the card. "What is this?" I asked, but when I looked up, the man was gone. The bell hadn't rung, the door hadn't opened. He had vanished. I clutched the card, my mind racing. The message was clear, but where could I go? The gas station felt like a prison, the rules its bars. And even if I left, I had a sinking feeling that whatever haunted this place would follow. The clock ticked closer to 4 a.m. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, growing darker, deeper. I felt the phantom's presence like a weight on my chest, pressing down harder with each passing second. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was survival. The gas station felt alive, its every creak and groan amplified in the oppressive silence. The walls seemed closer now, the space shrinking as my fear grew. I paced the length of the counter, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. My eyes darted to the windows, searching the dark expanse of the parking lot for movement. The clock ticked relentlessly, counting down the minutes until 4 a.m. At 3:45 a.m., the lights flickered. The fluorescent bulbs buzzed and dimmed, throwing the room into a patchwork of shadows. I froze, the card the stranger had left still clutched in my hand. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. The rules swirled in my mind, each one a fragile tether keeping me from falling apart. I hadn't broken another, at least, not yet. The bell above the door jingled. My head snapped up, my heart stuttering as the phantom stepped inside. He looked exactly as he had in the footage, tall, his face partially obscured by the brim of his hat, but the scar down his cheek was unmistakable. His presence was suffocating, an invisible pressure that made the air thick and heavy. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound. He simply stood there, his cold eyes fixed on me. I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself, my knuckles white. The rules were clear, don't look directly at him. But how could I not? His gaze pinned me in place, a predator locking onto its prey. My breath came in shallow bursts as I tore my eyes away, staring at the counter instead. The card sat there, its single word seared into my mind, run. The phantom's footsteps echoed as he moved closer, each step slow and deliberate. The sound sent chills racing down my spine. My vision blurred with panic, but I forced myself to focus. I couldn't speak, couldn't move, could barely think. I clung to the rules like a lifeline, repeating them over and over in my head. He stopped just feet away from me. I could feel his presence, an icy void that swallowed all warmth. My hands trembled as I fought the urge to glance up, to meet those piercing eyes again. He leaned in slightly, and I felt the faint brush of his breath, cold and unnatural. "You shouldn't have stayed," he said, his voice low and guttural, more a growl than speech. It was the first time I'd heard him speak, and it felt like nails dragging across my brain. "You broke the rules, Evan. You all break them in the end." I flinched at the sound of my name. He knew me, knew things about me no one else could. My chest tightened as the weight of his words settled over me. "What do you want?" I croaked, barely recognizing my own voice. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached out with a gloved hand, sliding the card closer to me. His fingers were long and thin, almost skeletal, and the gesture sent a fresh wave of dread coursing through me. I couldn't take it anymore. My survival instincts kicked in, and I bolted for the break room, slamming the door behind me. My hands fumbled to lock it as the lights flickered again, plunging the room into brief pockets of darkness. I pressed my ear against the door, listening for his footsteps, but there was nothing, only silence. Then, a knock. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud. It wasn't coming from the break room door but from the ceiling above me. My blood ran cold as I looked up, half expecting to see his face staring back at me. The knocking grew more insistent, rattling the thin walls. I backed away, tripping over the couch and collapsing onto the floor. The journal was still there, lying open where I'd left it. My eyes scanned the pages, desperate for any clue, any answer. The final entry seemed to taunt me, "When the cameras go black, it's too late. He's already inside." A loud crash shook the building, and the lights went out completely. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the journal as if it could protect me. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the faint glow of the exit sign near the front door. My breathing was ragged, each inhale catching in my throat. Footsteps echoed in the main room, slow, purposeful, and terrifyingly close. I crouched behind the couch, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure he could hear it. The footsteps stopped just outside the break room door, and I held my breath, praying he wouldn't come in. "Evan," he called, his voice dripping with malice. "There's nowhere to run." The door creaked open, and I bit back a scream. I could see his shadow stretching across the floor, long and distorted. He stepped inside, his movements unnaturally smooth, like a predator stalking its prey. I clutched the journal tighter, my mind racing for a plan. The phantom reached down and picked up the card from the counter. He held it up, as if offering it to me. "You had your chance," he said. "Now, you're mine." In a moment of blind desperation, I hurled the journal at him and bolted for the front door. The neon, open 24/7, sign flickered wildly as I ran past it, the cold night air hitting me like a wall. I didn't stop, didn't look back. My only thought was to get as far away from the gas station as possible. But even as I sprinted down the empty highway, the sound of laughter followed me, low, chilling, and impossibly close. The laughter clung to the air, faint but persistent, as if carried by an invisible wind. My legs burned as I pushed myself harder down the desolate stretch of Highway 281. The dark, endless desert on either side felt alive, the silhouettes of distant cacti warping into grotesque shapes in my peripheral vision. I dared not look back. I didn't need to see him to know he was there, stalking me like a shadow I couldn't escape. The gas station receded into the distance behind me, its flickering neon sign the only beacon in the sea of darkness. My mind raced, fragmented thoughts tumbling over one another. Where can I go? How far will I have to run? I clutched the card I hadn't realized I'd grabbed on my way out, its edges cutting into my palm. The single word, run, seemed more like a command than advice. After what felt like hours but could have been mere minutes, I spotted headlights in the distance, faint beams slicing through the inky black. Relief surged through me, though it was quickly tempered by caution. What if it was him? What if the phantom had already anticipated my escape? I staggered to the side of the road, throwing my arm out in desperation. The vehicle slowed as it approached, a battered pickup truck with rust along its doors. The driver rolled down the window, a grizzled man in his 60s eyeing me warily. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Yes," I gasped. "Please. Just drive." He didn't ask questions, just unlocked the door. I climbed in, slamming it shut as I glanced nervously back down the road. The gas station was barely visible now, but I swore I saw a figure standing under the neon glow, motionless, watching. The old man put the truck in gear, and the sight was swallowed by the desert as we sped away. We drove in silence for several miles, the hum of the engine and the crunch of tires on gravel the only sounds. I didn't dare speak, afraid that acknowledging my fear would give it power. Finally, the driver glanced at me. "You from around here?" "No," I said quickly. My throat was dry, and my voice came out cracked. "Just passing through." He grunted in acknowledgement but didn't press further. I noticed a rifle mounted on the rear window of the cab, its barrel gleaming faintly in the dim light. I felt a flicker of safety, though it was fleeting. I didn't think bullets could stop whatever was chasing me. The truck's headlights illuminated a sign ahead, "Welcome to Ashford, population 1,342. Relief coursed through me at the thought of reaching civilization, no matter how small. I could lose myself in the town, find a motel, and figure out my next move. The phantom wouldn't follow me here, would he? The driver dropped me off at the edge of town without a word. As the truck pulled away, its taillights disappearing into the night, I felt a pang of regret. I was alone again, the stillness of Ashford oppressive. The streets were eerily quiet, the faint glow of street lamps casting long shadows. I headed toward the nearest building, a shabby diner with a flickering open sign. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of stale coffee. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, her tired eyes narrowing as she saw me. "Rough night?" she asked, pouring a cup of coffee without waiting for an answer. I nodded, too exhausted to speak. I sat at the counter, the coffee warming my trembling hands. I glanced at the diner's clock, 4:13 a.m. The worst was over, or so I thought. The doorbell jingled behind me. My body tensed instinctively. I didn't turn around, my grip on the coffee mug tightening. The waitress greeted the newcomer, her voice cheerful but strained. "What can I get you?" "Just passing through," came the reply. The voice was deep, familiar, and chilling. I turned my head slightly, enough to catch a reflection in the diner's stainless steel napkin holder. The phantom stood in the doorway, his scar catching the light. He wasn't looking at me yet, but I knew he'd seen me. I forced myself to stay calm, lowering my gaze back to my coffee. "Don't look directly at him." "Anything else?" the waitress asked, her voice tinged with nervousness. "No," the phantom replied. just watching. He sat at a booth in the corner, his presence a black hole that sucked the air out of the room. I kept my eyes fixed on the counter, willing myself to stay invisible. The minutes crawled by, each second an eternity. I didn't know what to do. Running would be pointless, he'd follow, and I'd have nowhere to go. The waitress broke the silence. "You okay, Han?" she whispered, leaning closer to me. I shook my head, my lips trembling as I whispered back, "Don't look at him." Her expression faltered, confusion giving way to fear. She stepped back, her hands shaking as she picked up a coffee pot. The phantom didn't move, but his gaze bore into me, even from across the room. I could feel it, cold and unrelenting. Then the laughter started. Faint at first, a low chuckle that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere. It grew louder, filling the diner until it drowned out the hum of the fluorescent lights. The waitress dropped the coffee pot, the glass shattering on the floor. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted for the door, the laughter chasing me into the street. I ran blindly, my feet pounding the pavement as the world blurred around me. The laughter followed, a cacophony of madness that pierced my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of town, collapsing in the shadow of a crumbling billboard. The sun was rising now, its pale light washing over the desert. The laughter had stopped, but its echo lingered in my mind. I clutched the card in my hand, its message mocking me. Run. I had run, but it hadn't saved me. The phantom wasn't bound by rules of space or time. He was a predator, and I was his prey. As the first rays of sunlight touched the horizon, I thought I was safe. But then I heard it, a faint knock, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. The card slipped from my fingers, carried away by the wind. I stared into the rising sun, my hope fading as the knocking grew louder.